I was hoping, I went a lot of my life hoping I would be the first famous Michael Lewis, and he beat me to it. Although I've had that like temptation to submit a pitch to Vanity Fair or the New Yorker as Michael Lewis. Like I'd like to write a story on this phenomenon that's going on in Pope Francis and conspiracy theories or something, and see if they're willing to take my pitch. And then the other Michael Lewis will get the check. So welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of Peter's Field Hospital. My name is Mike Lewis, and I'm the managing editor of the website wherepeteris.com. Today, I am joined by Dan Amiri and David Lafferty, both contributors to WPI.
Hey, Mike. Hi, Mike. Glad to be here.
So, do you want to be DW or David in the podcast?
David is fine. Yeah. Okay. Or Dave. Well, Dave. I don't mind Dave either.
Oh, you don't mind Dave?
No.
D-Dub.
D-Dub is fine. My parents used to call me that, actually.
So a lot's been going on. Happy Easter.
Happy Easter to you, too.
Thank you very much. I want to start with Pope Francis, as always. So, guys, this was definitely an unusual Easter. As everyone has been experiencing, still on lockdown from the coronavirus pandemic, and Pope Francis has carried on. I want to draw our attention, Dan, both you and I did write about this, the Easter Vigil homily of Pope Francis. I thought it was very beautiful, and I thought it was very reassuring. There were two themes that he spoke about that jumped out to me. One was the central theme of the homily, which was hope. The other thing, and it sort of brought together a lot of things that I had been thinking about, was the idea of how Christians need to reassure others, how they need to offer consolation. Here's a quote from the homily. Everyone is in need of reassurance. And if we who have touched the word of life do not give it, who will? How beautiful is it to be Christians who offer consolation, who bear the burdens of others, and who offer encouragement, messengers of life in a time of death. Now, to me, this is central. This is an illustration or a description of Pope Francis's entire idea of evangelization. Just this open and welcoming presentation of God's love to others. Dan, did you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I would lead off first by saying that you asked me at the last podcast what I thought the Pope was going to talk about, and I said hope and suffering, and then you cut that part out of the podcast. So I'm just going to go on the record now and say that I knew what Pope Francis was going to talk about before we talked about it.
Unfortunately, I deleted the raw file, so there's no way.
What really struck me was that this is coming straight out of something that Pope Benedict has talked about a lot too, which is the relationship between hope and suffering. And the two are very closely connected with one another, because it's in our suffering that Christian hope provides the way forward. And this is something that Pope Francis talked about in his homily, right? So hope provides courage. And in Benedict's language, he describes hope as performative and not just informative. Hope actually achieves in you what you seek in your life, which is to attain heaven, glory with God. And all these themes were touched on by Pope Francis in his homily. And I sort of broke it out, that line that you just mentioned right there about, who else is going to share that hope if not us? And that's really that Christian call that I think is so important that we kind of lose. Yes, hope is important. Hope is a virtue, but it's also a responsibility. Who else is going to hear it if not from us?
And Dave, I want to share another quote with you, one that speaks directly to hope. And this is probably the most frequently quoted one from that homily. Pope Francis says, "Tonight we acquire a fundamental right that can never be taken away from us, the right to hope. It is a new and living hope that comes from God. It is not mere optimism. It is not a pat on the back or an empty word of encouragement. It is a gift from heaven, which we could not have earned on our own." Now, that last bit, we could not have earned on our own. It speaks to a loving and giving God, one who cares about us and loves us unconditionally and through no merit of ours. Do you have any thoughts about this, about your own faith life, how this relates to what Pope Francis has been preaching since day one?
Well, absolutely. I think that what Pope Francis is putting forward is that, our as a church, we're founded on hope. We're not founded on fear, which I think is what so many of us are experiencing right now, and often for good reason. There's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot of uncertainties right now, things that we just can't figure out, that our governments can't figure out, and we need to place our hope in something that will come after. And I think that that's the message of Easter, that throughout all this darkness, throughout all this despair, that there will be a resurrection, that we're going to come out on the other end transformed. I think that's what Pope Francis is talking about.
And you talk about the darkness. I just think about how the first stretch of this lockdown, the first stretch for most of us in this pandemic, took place during Lent. And I think in many ways this, and hopefully for many people, this was one of the most profound Lenten experiences we've ever had. Dan, do you get that sense? Was that how you experienced Lent at all, or did you feel disconnected?
It was, I thought I was going to go into Lent lamenting how I had to give up alcohol for however many days, but I came out of Lent thinking how much, well, the same thing, but also like all these penances were just forced upon me. But I think we talked about this before. It's such a great time for the church to shine forth. And I want to point out all these amazing priests and Pope Francis himself, who have really just put themselves out there. I mean, so many stories of these priests volunteering to go into hospitals and really, I mean, putting their lives on the line. And you talk about sharing hope with others and giving life to other people. This is the church on the front lines, and I love that aspect of it. And so, Lent has been a time of, it's been difficult, it's been challenging in my own way. There's never been a time that I felt prouder to be a Catholic than I am today.
That's interesting. What you were referring to is probably Cardinal Cupich's designation of 24 younger priests in the Archdiocese of Chicago to be specially designated chaplains with a ministry to coronavirus victims. And I know there was another priest, Dominican, I think his name is Father Patrick Hyde, who's on Twitter, who announced that he had been picked for his deanery to be a specifically designated as a chaplain.
Well, there was a priest right down the road from me who had been administering last rites. I don't know the full story, but now there's a fear that he has been, exposed and he's in quarantine. So it wasn't even necessarily something that I think he was seeking out, like getting himself, in danger. He wasn't seeking to put himself in danger. It was just him being a priest and doing the things that priests are called to do. And now he has to be in quarantine. So,
yeah, unfortunately, the nature of this particular disease is that if we aren't careful, if priests aren't careful, they could be unwitting transmitters of the disease. And that's one of the things, is that people are most contagious with this COVID-19 before they show symptoms, for 1 to 3 days before they show symptoms. So if a priest or anybody was to go about their regular business, they could be infecting people left and right, and then realize they're sick. So that's the extra precaution that has to go into that. It's amazing.
This is very different from, I mean, there have been some calls for, priests to bring the sacraments to people no matter what the consequences, no matter what the cost, no matter what they've been told by their bishops. And I think that's can be a potentially very reckless, dangerous thing. But this is something different. And I admire the way that the bishops have handled this, the way that the church has taken on the responsibility of not being part of the spread of this virus, even though it causes a lot of suffering for people within the church. We don't have access to the sacraments in many cases. It's a very difficult time, but we're all going to suffer through it together. I think that's what's so admirable about this.
I have a feeling that there are going to be a number of young men who are inspired to be priests during this time.
Yes.
And one of the things you're talking about, how it's impressed you that the church has been so proactive and been so responsive and been so cautious. This is something that I fear that a lot of members of the American church don't quite comprehend or haven't quite grasped, is that, and this is something that I've written about on subjects like climate change. We hear about anti-vaxxers, is this instinctive rejection of expertise or people who are professionals in scientific fields. The church is not a scientific authority, and people will remind you the Pope is not an authority in the area of science. So if you're not an authority in the area of science, then who is the most prudent person to go to when it comes to figuring out how to deal with these scientific issues and exactly what's going on, so that you can develop a Christian response? And my response, and I think the reasonable response, is to go to the authorities on scientific issues, which would be, in this case, epidemiologists, virologists, public health officials. David, you talk a lot about conspiracy theories. I don't know if this is an appropriate seg into that, but do you see that this mentality has grown in the American church? And by American, because you're Canadian, we're going international. I mean, North American. This is something that seems to be more pervasive, perhaps because of the internet. But the fact that it seems almost mainstream in certain sectors of the church to be skeptical of the scientific establishment, to be skeptical of journalistic reporting, and to think that they're basically to reject common knowledge, or to reject the mainstream narrative of, we're not just talking about motives or agendas, we're talking about plain facts. What are your thoughts on this?
I see it as not a problem that's specific to Catholics or to American Catholics. It's a much more widespread problem that relates to the populist mentality. I think it's a political mentality. I think that at its root that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, and part of that populist mentality is this idea that the world is run by elites who pretend to be sort of experts, but what they're actually doing is creating mechanisms of control in order to, let's say, limit personal freedoms, in order to break down the barriers between countries, and then also to attack religion, and particularly to attack Christianity. Now, with all conspiracy theories, there's a bit of truth mixed in with the nonsense. So, there are, of course, you should never just be completely accepting of everything you hear. You should always listen to things critically. Compare the opinions of different experts. But we really can't lose that trust, that basic trust in the scientific community, the global scientific community, and in the goodwill of most people, including most political leaders in the world. Otherwise, we're not moving towards peace. We're moving towards a sort of apocalyptic scenario where we have the kind of ordinary people, or in a Catholic context, it's usually more the faithful remnant of the church against a kind of hierarchy of elites. And the church itself often gets sort of lumped into that category of the elites. Pope Francis is sometimes portrayed as being a globalist or listening to the UN too uncritically and that sort of thing. So yeah, we have to be careful to avoid that kind of Manichaean view of the world that we get with populism. The world is not that simple, and although there are good reasons to be skeptical and critical, we can't just simply lose faith in reason and lose faith in science.
And I don't mean to say that we should blindly obey authority or blindly accept things. It's just this overall skepticism. Now, to be fair, church authority hasn't exactly been stellar in the last several decades. A lot of it they've brought upon themselves, this distrust. Dan, do you have a sense of maybe why some people automatically look at the bishops, look at the Pope as elites, as globalists, as part of a conspiracy to take down the church from within? Is this something that you see in parish life? Is this an instinct that you can relate to at all?
Well, I think it's just two fundamentally different visions of what church is. And it's something I touched on in an article about how to choose a church, really, is a church there to cater to what I believe, or is a church there to teach you and to help you along, to help you grow in holiness? And it's just two completely different ways of looking at things. And of course, even in this position where, the church is here to help us grow in holiness, we're here to learn from the church, there's still a lot of room for cooperation. Co-responsibility was a huge area of focus, and we're supposed to be engaged with our church. There's a lot of room for us to actually participate in the life of the church. But I think where this attitude of, conspiracy comes in is this feeling of maybe this feeling of being left out of the church. You're feeling like you're not able to participate in the church as much as you would like. You feel like your voice isn't being heard. And so everything has become this big conspiracy against you and what you believe, when I really just think the answer could be as simple as having more communication, making sure that everyone in the parish feels like they're part of a community, feels like they're contributing in some way. And honestly, I really just feel like it comes down to people not feeling welcome in the church that they belong to.
That's very much, I think there's a lot of truth behind that. Something that's baffled me almost is this idea, and we've talked about it before, that there are a number of prominent Catholics who are blaming this pandemic on whether it's immorality or the church's corruption, or more specifically about the St. Francis Day ceremony that was held on the Vatican lawn that's been pegged as a pagan ritual, even though that's totally untrue. It's been thoroughly debunked. There was no pagan intention behind what they were doing, and it was a matter of cultural misunderstanding. Yet there have been a number of prominent Catholics who in all seriousness, blame the pandemic for it. One priest on Facebook, who I'm personally familiar with, and I know Paul Fahey is, Father Carlos Martins, who's a priest originally from Canada, who posted on Facebook that this pandemic was brought about by paganism in the Vatican. He's a well-known priest, very smart guy. He came to my parish. He carries a collection of sacred relics with him. I think he has the largest collection of sacred relics from saints, has a piece of the true cross, has a piece of the crown of thorns that he brings around the country with him. And a lot of people show up, and he gives a talk. And I was totally impressed by him, by his personality. He's known as one of the foremost experts on Saint Maria Goretti, and yet he's bought into this narrative. There are other people that we've discussed plenty of times, Archbishop Vigano, of course, Taylor Marshall. As our conspiracy theorist expert, David, why? I mean, this just strikes me as such a bizarre mentality and something that's just so foreign to my understanding of Catholicism. To me, it's baffling, but clearly there are people with impressive backgrounds, impressive academic credentials, mainstream pastors in the church who've bought into this kind of narrative. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, first thought is just that it seems incredibly narcissistic to take this kind of view of the pandemic. I mean, as much as we're deeply involved in the church and in matters regarding the church, this pandemic is affecting everyone in the world. It's not just affecting Catholics, but to see it as the result of something so specific to recent Catholic media nonsense. It just shows that this is I think the result of being on Facebook too much, or reading, being on Twitter too much, and you get this kind of tunnel vision. But that's a place where these kind of I would say this is less a conspiracy theory and more of a sort of apocalyptic theory. That's where these kind of ideas can thrive. That when you have that kind of closed off view and you're only seeing what sort of LifeSite News and Church Militant and these kind of organizations are sending your way, you can develop a very warped sense of what's going on. I mean, you can look at any other group any other religious group, and you'll probably find apocalyptic conspiracy theorists there who are blaming the pandemic on things that are entirely different. And you'll even find people in conspiracy theory like QAnon and stuff blaming the pandemic on, let's say, Chinese bioweapons or whatever. So there's going to be all of these kind of apocalyptic scenarios and conspiracy theories floating around out there. I find it sad that priests would put that out and just allow it to be shared like that. I know that the priest in question who put this out is a member of the Companions of the Cross, and I have great respect for the Companions. They were founded by Father Bob Bedard, and my parish priest are Companions priests. But so I find it very disappointing to see that.
It's almost as if we keep going back to that image of two churches or two mainstreams. But to me, this just it's astounding to me that the church is our mother. The church is our guide. The Pope is the center of doctrinal unity. He's basically the point at which we're all supposed to find a source of truth. And it seems that once formerly loyal Catholics decide that the Pope isn't right for them, that they go down these roads, it seems to be devoid of Christian hope. It's this negative view. It's this fear of something, this fear that they're going to lose everything that's sacred to them. Yet that's not the Christian message. And especially since we've been taught that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. That doesn't mean that only a small remnant of Catholics is going to remain faithful and the entire hierarchy is going to go overboard. There's a guarantee that Peter is the rock upon which Christ built his church. Dan, do you see the same lack of hope that I'm seeing in this in this type of mentality?
You nailed it. I think that's exactly right. And you just contrast the sort of messaging or the approach that Francis takes versus some of these detractors or conspiracy theorists, or however you want to just describe them. You know, hope is what the church is about. That's what we provide to people. And when you hear this from people about, oh, it's chastisement, it's everything's a sacrilege, everything is awful. This isn't a message of hope. This is sort of that fire and brimstone message. Like if you don't correspond to my way of doing things, you're going to hell. Or if you don't correspond to my way of doing things, the church is going to hell. Or however you want to go, however far down you want to go down that road. But I think Francis, it's really just, what is the church about? It's the gift of mercy. It's the gift of hope. It's the gift of life. And if you aren't out there spending your time and energy participating in this mission, then you're effectively not participating in the life of the church. And I maybe that's a little bit strongly worded, but these people are doing way, way too much harm for my liking. They're out there confusing people, discouraging people, causing despair in people, or people feel like they need to look out for the 3 days of darkness. Like, this is not the church of Jesus Christ. This is not the church of hope or the church of life. And it's extremely frustrating. All I can do is do what we do here at Where Peter Is just continue to get out that the church's message through the words of Pope Francis. The church's hope, the church's mercy.
I see this in LifeSite's recent reporting on Dan Burke's experience. Dan Burke, formerly of EWTN. I have immense sympathy for what he and his wife went through. Both contracted the coronavirus, and he suffered a great deal through it, but he's come out the other end, which is wonderful. But he's been saying that the coronavirus, he now believes, is the result of impiety and sacrilege, and in particular communion on the hand. He's saying that when people take communion on the hand, they don't look to see if there are any particles left on their hand, and then these may fall on the floor, and that's a sacrilege. He actually compares it to what Satanists do. He says, Catholics, they don't have Satanist intent, but it's the same sort of sacrilege that you would find like in a black mass. To me, that just I can't process that. I can't imagine that the way that my kids, when they go to church, when they receive communion, that's some sort of sacrilege akin to the Black Mass, and that God is punishing us for these sorts of actions. It's such a profoundly pessimistic view of the church, so devoid of hope, that it really, to me, it turns the church into an idol. It turns the church into some kind of it turns our God into an angry, vengeful God who will punish anyone who makes even the slightest mistake, even if it's unintentional. And that's not the message of hope that Pope Francis is putting forward. There's something that's trapped them in this profoundly negative view of the world and of the church and of Pope Francis. And I don't know how to break into it and let some light in, but I hope that it does come in eventually.
It's one of those things that if you think about it for more than 2 seconds, it'd be nice if everyone expressed reverence for the Eucharist, and it's a great way for. It would be great if everyone just did pay attention to how they received the Eucharist, but at the same time, you kind of get to the point. It's like, what is Burke really about? He's saying that if everyone is committing the sacrilege, that we're just a horrible church, that the church leaders have made the wrong decision, that the church leaders are condoning sacrilege. Eventually it comes back to, like, we should have never have allowed it, and the church is wrong to do so.
And the people, I think people are reminded more often to, even if they are receiving on the hand, to be careful and to receive it with reverence. I think that's something that's always been emphasized to me in a variety of parishes that I've been part of.
That leads into the Pachamama thing. I just don't understand the connection here. Is it sort of this Old Testament model a God who punishes people, and that's what we're facing with that's what we're faced with right now? I mean, is that the argument?
I think it is an Old Testament. It goes back to the Old Testament, but at the same time, it draws a lot on prophecy. So it draws a lot on Fatima and this idea of a coming divine chastisement that will happen unless certain things are done by church leadership to reform the church. And I mean, I think a lot of traditionalist groups have been waiting for this sort of divine chastisement and kind of reading the signs of the times for a very long time to try to figure out, is it coming? Is it now? And so any kind of world-shaking event, anything that's great geopolitical significance, they're gonna see it through that framework.
And that's one of the things that really bothers me. A lot of these people I followed and admired prior to this papacy, they built audiences. They seemed entirely faithful and devoted and loyal to the Pope and loyal to the church. And they've used, unfortunately, as they've turned away from the papacy and turned away from trust in the church, they've exploited their existing audiences. Like this Father Carlos, the reason why I pointed out is his blog or his Facebook post had over 1,000 likes, over 1,000 shares, 700 comments, something like that. And a lot of the comments, some of the people I knew personally through Catholic circles, some people I had met online, a lot of them looked like friendly Catholic people, and their responses were like, "Oh, my father, I had no idea that this was going on in the Vatican." These are people who aren't following these things closely. They've probably decided to follow him on Facebook because they had a good experience at his Treasures of the Church presentation and visited his relics and venerated them. And he's taking that audience, very faithful, very devotional, very, very pious, people who are hardworking, maybe not totally informed about church news, but that's never been a requirement of the faith. And he's scandalized them about something that they won't even acknowledge that there's another side to the story regarding whether or not that was paganism that went on in the Vatican. They won't recognize what Querida Amazonia said about rituals that don't have pagan intent and take into account the traditions of the indigenous culture. That's the thing. I mean, where Peter is, we started 2 years ago. Dave, I think you've been with us for about a year now. This is we do our part, but there are really a lot of us out there. There's Austin Ivory and Massimo on Twitter defending Francis, and there's Stephen Walford put up a really good fight during 2017 and put out his book in 2018. But that's the thing that really disappoints me is even though there are a lot of supporters of Francis out there, they're not saying anything about these public figures that are truly leading people astray. Dan, I don't know, you don't like to get into the polarization.
No, I will say, so you're right, Mike. I tend to try to stay emotionally removed from the back and forth, but when I do see people getting led astray, that does sort of rile in me a bit of I guess righteous anger. I'm concerned. People can spout on Twitter, they can spout on Facebook, and they can say what they want to say, but when you actually see real life people being led astray, that's beyond the pale. Now, I will say, what we do at Where Peter Is, it's noble, but unfortunately, we're very small. And all these people with power and influence and money, they're the ones that are running big Catholic media right now. And you have a lot of connections with. I mean, we can detail it, but Christopher Lamb's book or Austin Ivory's book. A lot of these books just go into all these connections with powerful Catholic media, the money that they have, the ability they have to get their message out there, and to basically just run their own show. Like, just the most recent example that comes to mind is the co-authorship, quote unquote, of a book that Benedict did not write, but some people insist that he did. So it's just this idea that there's a lot of people with the ability to get their message out there, and there's not a lot of ability for us to kind of counteract that. Unfortunately, we're still growing, right, with the reach that we have. But I just hope that people kind of take that into consideration as they listen and they read our articles, that they do share things that they find positive and encouraging, hopeful, inspiring, something that they felt like they learned a little bit. So can you continue sharing that with other people? I think that makes a huge difference.
And don't forget to sponsor us on Patreon. It's a little plug. Yeah, I mean, we're doing what we can, and I know we're having an impact. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people that got a head start on us. We started in 2018. I was hoping that we would be done with the fighting and the polarization and the dubia and amoris laetitia. My goal was to finish by summer 2018. And then that August, Vigano's testimony came out. And the resistance to Pope Francis seemed to grow bigger and stronger and louder. The real world consequence, to me, what was shocking was when the young man from Austria, Alexander Schuguel, tossed that figure into the Tiber. And now we know this was entirely coordinated and funded by Taylor Marshall.
It wasn't a scoop by LifeSite News. It was Taylor Marshall disclosing this, sort of bragging about it, if I'm not mistaken. He was bragging about how he funded this guy's airfare and his partner to go to Rome and do this thing, and then they basically got him out of Dodge as soon as they could, so he wouldn't get arrested. I mean, it was sort of an air raid, if you will.
And David, you listened to the entire episode, correct?
Yes, I did, and it was a fascinating conversation. It was a very, very long conversation they had, and he only revealed that bombshell in the second hour of it, and so I think a lot of people missed it. They've also, in recent podcasts, he was also talking to Schuguel about encouraging people to find sort of renegade priests, people they just call good priests, who will bring people the sacraments in defiance of their bishops, in defiance of public health authorities, or hold underground masses. It's something that came out in that interview that I find very interesting. Is this both Marshall and Schuguel, and I think a lot of the sort of Pope Francis resistance, they seem to thrive on this idea that they are somehow a kind of countercultural force, acting kind of in the underground through social media, through these kind of networks that they're forging to form what they consider to be the sort of true church, as opposed to the church that we're all familiar with. And I think that this is something that's grown out of this idea of Catholicism being a countercultural force in the world, which it is to some extent. But I think a lot of the people who came into the church in, like, say, the 2000s or after, during the sort of John Paul II, Pope Benedict era, part of the appeal was that they saw the church as being a sort of counterforce to global liberalism, particularly in the battle against abortion and euthanasia. And so there was a sort of mystique that came with that, a sense of purpose that the church was so completely opposed to the modern world. And when you see someone like Pope Francis, who in their eyes is being more accommodating, is sort of reaching out to certain groups, like, the LGBTQ community and people like that, the divorced and remarried. To them, it seems like he's making accommodations to liberalism. And so the church loses its status as that countercultural force, that sort of icon of resistance to liberalism. And so they have to find that feeling somewhere else. And so they've gravitated, I think, towards kind of ultra conservatism or traditionalism in a lot of cases. And that's been fueled by social media.
Yeah, I would just say as a side note before you continue here is, I don't know if any of these people are going to read the Pope's homily on the Easter Vigil, but he's spending, it's a short homily, but he does spend some time railing against abortion. It's plain as day. I mean, he's going to be as against abortion as anyone else, but again, it's just this inability to listen to a Pope who actually takes care to think of more issues, to think of a broader spectrum of issues than just one or two.
Yeah, if he's not talking about that all the time, they think that that's some kind of betrayal, because that's what they feel he should be talking about all the time. But yeah, I have no doubt that Pope Francis is just as much against abortion as all previous popes have been.
I think one thing that I've always meant to do, but I don't have the time, and it's probably not worth the time, but I'd be curious to see, to take the 7 years of Francis's papacy and weigh it against Benedict's the 8-year papacy and a 7-year stretch of John Paul II's papacy, and see how many mentions of unborn, life in the womb, and abortion Pope Francis has made. Because I feel like he makes these statements and then they get lost in the shuffle. I mean, some of the lines that he gets knocked for, on the flight back from the Philippines, he talked about that line about being like rabbits. Well, that came in the middle of a response where he was actually defending Humanae Vitae. And he was saying, listen, this is a true teaching. It doesn't mean not using contraception doesn't mean that you're going to have 20 children. But, and he went on to make this point, and that they laser focused on, as if he was saying that people with large families were breeding like rabbits, which wasn't his point at all.
The same thing was starting to happen to Pope Benedict, because, again, by the time he had resigned, Twitter had become a thing, but in the 2000s, social media was still getting going. But I remember when Pope Benedict made a particular comment about the use of condoms by gay prostitutes, that it might be in some way morally sort of a step towards moral responsibility to use a condom. Immediately I remember on Drudge Report, I saw the headline, Pope says condoms okay, or something like that. Totally misconstrued, totally taken out of context. And I mean, you saw that starting with Pope Benedict, and it just continued on with Pope Francis, but in a much more extreme way. We've got Twitter and Facebook and all of these, and all this sort of citizen journalism going on full blast, where things can just be taken out of context and blasted across the internet in a really unprecedented way. And I think he's been a victim of that in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I wanted to relay my experience of hearing that story for the first time. I was driving and I was listening to NPR, and I heard the news report that Pope Benedict has approved condoms for homosexuals.
Yes.
And I almost drove off the road when I heard that. But I mean, the sad thing is, EWTN and the Register and CNA and all of these sources immediately wanted to jump to his defense. They immediately clarified the issue. People who would bring up mainstream people who would bring up a misconstrued version of that story, or radical traditionalists who cited Pope Benedict's quote unquote approval of condoms, they would say, no, no, no. What he was talking about was the intention of the person. He wasn't saying, and that's totally gone out the window. It doesn't exist for Pope Francis. Nobody, except for where Peter is doing that for Francis. But I think it's the same type of misrepresentation that's going on in the media. It's just that now the Catholic media is doing it. I want to change to another topic real quick along these same lines, but we're talking about this silly season of Catholic apocalypticism, this distrust of the common sense narrative, these beliefs in conspiracy theories, these wild supernatural ideas about God punishing people by sending this plague upon humanity. One thing that early on I thought that people like Taylor Marshall and Steve Skojec and a lot of these mainstream critics, Robert Spaman, Thomas Wynandy, these prominent critics of Pope Francis, I thought there was an additional level of seriousness to them. I thought that maybe they like to fan the flames of, this quote from this interview by Scalfari that Pope Francis made. I thought they were doing that to sort of fan the flames and get their audiences hyped up, but they didn't really. I couldn't believe that they really believed this stuff. The moment where my jaw dropped was when that letter that was signed by a number of prominent theologians that it formally accused Pope Francis of heresy, the one that the Dominican Father Aidan Nichols signed, where it actually in their list of complaints about Pope Francis talked about the rainbow cross that he wore, which was a Latin American Catholic youth program put it together. The colors were not in the same order as the pride flag. Each of them represented a different region of Latin America. There was a whole worksheet behind it. It was debunked on Twitter. It was debunked in the blogosphere. There were articles saying that, no, this is not the gay pride flag. And then that staff, that crozier that Francis used, that people said it was a witch's sting. And the fact that those two urban legends, that those two totally false stories found themselves in a document that purported to be by serious theologians making serious charges against the Pope, it blew my mind. But now what we're seeing with Taylor Marshall, what we're seeing with Archbishop Vigano and Dan Burke is they really do believe this stuff. It's incomprehensible to me that people who should have more common sense actually think that these wild things that have no basis in reality are true and they accept them as fact. Now, Dave, I know you've talked about the anti-Francis vortex, and I don't know if this is related to that, but one thing that I know Dan and some of the other contributors have noticed is that the moment that these public figures decide to take that final step to turn against Francis, they enter into this void, or they start going down this path of holding these more and more bizarre positions and become more and more extreme. And I think that this coronavirus pandemic and the response to that has been similar. Am I speaking to you here? Do you understand where I'm going with this? Do you have any thoughts along this train of thought?
Yeah, I see. I get what you're saying, that this is not, in most cases, I mean, some people call them, grifters, right? People trying to make money off generating controversy about the church. I think that in some cases, they are making money off this, but in some cases, no, it's more than that. They really, really do believe it, or at least they seem to, because there is a progression. They keep going further and further into the sort of outer reaches of, I guess, extreme traditionalism and that sort of thing. Of course, they never actually go beyond, right? Like they never actually make that final break. And so that shows that there is, I think, a need for attention. I mean, it's not just about money, but it's also about attention. It's to bring attention on what they have to say. If they actually took that step and left the church, completely rejected the authority of Pope Francis, or if they adopt some of the conspiracy theories that say that Pope Francis is not really Pope, that would sort of place them in the lunatic fringe. So they have an interest in staying just in that kind of perfect area where they can generate as much controversy as possible while still be considered somewhat part of mainstream Catholicism.
Dan, just to close, bringing us back from the surreal and back to the reality of Easter, you wrote a great piece about hope and about how the resurrected Christ brings us hope and how hope is central to the Christian message. How does Pope Francis give you hope in regard to the future of the church? And how can he give help to Christians who are maybe worried about the future, or fear the coronavirus, or are distrustful of what they're hearing on the news? Do you think he has something that he can offer to them?
I think that Pope Francis would be the first to tell you that he offers nothing to people except for what Christ has already offered. And I think this is the message that Pope Francis has consistently given. He's here to speak to Christ, his gift of mercy. And coming back to this homily, this hope is really a remembrance. It's something that's happened. It's something that we remember, but we also embody it. We live with it. We look forward to it. And I think Pope Francis is just constantly calling us to just remind us of what Christ has already done. And he does it in his words, I would argue, very practically, very beautifully, very accessibly, is something that I think, someone who may be coming to the Catholic Church for the first time, they could read Gaudete Exsultate and actually learn something and read. And it's not impenetrable. And I just think he's accessible in his writing, but also in his example. And I think that does give me hope for the future, because it points to a church that is still getting back to its roots. It's still looking back to that event in history and walking forward with Christ. And I think as long as the church can do that, we're going to be okay.
And Dave, you've been a little bit silent. You've written one piece recently. We haven't heard a lot from you this Lent. I was wondering if there's anything in particular about Pope Francis during this pandemic that has really stood out for you and that you think others might benefit from.
Whenever Lent comes along, I don't usually give up anything in particular. I know a lot of people do that, but I usually find that, okay, something's going to come along during Lent that's going to challenge me spiritually, and it's going to kind of put me to the test. And I always have faith that that's going to happen. And I did this time, and yeah, definitely something came along, and that was the pandemic. And it really did. It took me some time to try to figure out really what's going on and how to respond to it. But I think actually the beacon through a lot of this for me has been Pope Francis. And like Dan said, it's not that he's, what he's offering as a person is also, I think, very important, and he shows that he is one of us, right? Like he's going through this lockdown just like anyone else. He's suffering from the same sort of deprivations, dealing with the same confusion about the future. So just on a very human level, I really appreciate him being so visible and so willing to talk very frankly about the confusion that we're all feeling. What he brings to us ultimately is the message of Jesus and this message of hope. And that's what I've been clinging to, and that's what's brought me through this time so far.
Well, thank you very much, guys, for joining me. I want to wish all of our listeners a very happy Easter. Stay safe and see you next time.